Spider-Man Hostile Takeover, Chapter 23. She sat in Fisk's office again. MJ had been trying to reach Peter all morning, but they kept missing each other. At least his messages said he was okay. The story in the paper wasn't clear, but it seemed like both he and the Shocker had been cornered the previous night, although Spider-Man had escaped. According to the report, Peter fled the scene as soon as the cops arrived. The Shocker wasn't the real Shocker, but he did seem to be involved in the bombing. The police were trying to sort it all out, even while they downplayed Spider-Man's role in the arrest. Ever since the night of the explosion, they struggled to find time together. Peter was throwing every spare minute into his efforts to bring down Wilson Fisk. They'd never even finished their conversation, but that was largely MJ's decision. He was struggling, which made it a less than ideal time to fine-tune the relationship. The relationship would survive, she hoped. For now, she had to get her head in the game. Fisk had invited her in after another of her stories had run. It had outlined some of her plans for upcoming development projects, but had taken more of a hard news angle than her editor had originally wanted. MJ had compared Fisk's projections with plans filed with the city, and she interviewed some of the contractors. The bottom line had been that it seemed like reality was going to fall short of Fisk's promises. Robbie Robertson had called her into his office. "You're a features writer," he said. "Features. If you have a lead like that, you let someone know, and they'll pass it along to an appropriate reporter. If it checks out, you get to participate. You do not choose for yourself which stories to write. Are we clear?" MJ had nodded. Then he grinned. "I'll also say that this is a hell of a story. You're going to make an outstanding reporter." The smile disappeared. "But not if you can't learn to play nice with others." She understood the point. Afraid she'd be told to drop it, she pursued the angle herself. Now that he made it clear what procedure to follow, she wouldn't be able to feign ignorance. In the meantime, she assumed Fisk had brought her in because he was upset about the story. He couldn't do anything about it, of course, so he tried to find some other way to defuse her. When she was shown into his office, a meeting seemed to be breaking up, and she had to work her way through a throng of Wall Street types. They were talking excitedly about the municipal bonds, which seemed interesting to MJ, but she wasn't sure if she'd get a chance to follow up on it. Especially not after her most recent dressing down. A young woman joined them and was introduced as Maya Lopez. She barely spoke, but mostly studied MJ with a nasty stare. She hadn't exactly seemed warm the first time they met, but now MJ felt sure she never wanted to cross her. Fisk glanced in Lopez's direction from time to time. "Miss Watson," Fisk said. "That was quite a story the Bugle ran yesterday. You are keeping the people in my public relations office very busy." "My job is to report the truth," she said. "Oh, the truth is an elusive thing," he replied coolly. "Do you believe your story tells the whole truth?" "A story can never be complete," she said. "The best reporter can do is to relate the facts that are currently available. Once I'd done the research, I contacted your media office and gave them a chance to respond in the piece. No one got back to me." "Perhaps newspapers view deadlines differently than corporate offices. If you had waited a little longer, you would have received information that cast things in a different light." "And now you want me to write about this new information?" "Of course not," Fisk said. "No doubt the story you wrote is an enormous accomplishment for you. You made me look bad. Reporters live for such things. But it is not a matter of great importance to us. Businesses receive cuts and bruises every day. It's the way the game is played. And while the story is a new line on your resume, something your coworkers may even remember years from now, by tomorrow, the public will have already forgotten. I don't concern myself with trivialities. The fact that she was sitting there seemed to dispute this claim, but MJ chose not to point this out. Then, what can I do for you? I wonder what your goals are, Miss Watson. I mean your long-term goals. You are a reasonably talented writer, and likely you enjoy working with words. But there are many options other than journalism. There are positions in my corporate sector that would satisfy your need to be creative, but allow you to live a much more satisfying life. Are you offering me a job? MJ asked. It came out as more of an incredulous burst than she would have intended, but it seemed so ridiculous. One slightly unfavorable story, and Fisk wanted to buy her. It was so heavy-handed. She tried to follow it up with a cheery smile. He chuckled. It still sounded ominous. I'm not offering you a position in my company at this time, no, he said. I am merely suggesting that a position might open up at a future date for which you would be very well suited. If you were to ask me to hold such a position for you, I could do so, and even, let us say, advance your salary so that the trifling paycheck you currently receive from the Bugle doesn't diminish your options. MJ's smile felt as though it might fall off and shatter on the floor. This was exactly the sort of thing Peter had warned her about. She had gotten close to Fisk, and now he wanted to own her. If he couldn't own her, then what? She heard enough stories about his rage to worry. While beating a young reporter to death wouldn't be entirely out of character, it was fairly unlikely. She hadn't just wandered in off the street. Her editor knew where she was. She logged in with the security downstairs. Then there was the silent woman, Aya Lopez. Judging from the way he kept glancing in her direction, it seemed as if she somehow kept Fisk contained. No amount of logic was going to help her deal with this. It wasn't as if she could agree to be Fisk's paid lackey. That meant she was to decline. Of course, there were lots of ways to do that, and the trick was to appeal to his own sense of ego, rather than anger him. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Fisk, she said, but journalism is my goal. It always has been. I love working at the Bugle, and the corporate side of things doesn't hold much of an interest for me right now. She waited, but Fisk just smiled. I understand, Miss Watson. I appreciate that you have your own goals. It's worth pointing out, however, that my company has a controlling interest in a number of media outlets. I'm sure things would be easier if I had a patron, she said, and you'd be a powerful ally. But I like to see how far I can go on my own before I start asking for help. Entirely understandable, he said. Indeed, it's admirable. I wish more journalists had your integrity. I do the best I can, she said. I suspect most people do the same. You may be giving most people far too much credit. He pivoted slightly in his chair, a clear sign that he wanted to change the topic. I'd like to send you to see one of my senior accounting officers, who will go over some of the numbers you ran in your piece. I'm not saying you had your information wrong, but for a lack of context suggests a false interpretation. That could be very unfortunate. Very slowly, MJ let out her breath. Peter was right. Crossing Fisk was dangerous. But he was an emotional being, like anyone else. and could be managed. She stepped into what might have been a dangerous situation, and she handled it. She deserved a pat on the back for this one. She also realized she needed to trust herself more. Peter and Fisk had come to blows because Spider-Man came at Fisk web shooting and Fisk swinging. MJ had a different approach, and it produced different results. She had faith in herself. She wished Peter had more faith in her. MJ thanked Fisk and shook hands with him and Maya Lopez as she left the office. It had been a long and possibly pointless meeting. Fisk wanted her to write an article that would largely undermine her previous piece. She didn't want to do that, but agreed to meet the accountant to see if there were any angles she hadn't considered. Even now, her mind began to churn through future ideas she could pitch that would allow her to stay at the Fisk story, throw the man a few crumbs, but still dig deeper. There were angles covering some of the subcontractors, perhaps, or a piece on how neighboring planning that might be influenced by the new construction projects. Maybe even seeing what the Wall Street types had been up to. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost bumped into a trio of men. They wore business suits, but they definitely weren't the finance types. They screamed military, or at least ex-military. "I'm sorry." She looked up at the giant of a man with whom she'd almost collided. "I was lost in thought." "Not at all, ma'am," he said, looking through her, but not at her. Interaction with an unknown female must not have been a part of the mission parameters, she thought. Not the friendliest of people, but still, a reporter didn't get far if she didn't at least try. "I'm sorry if my meeting went on a little long," she said. "I hope I didn't make you wait." "No, ma'am," he answered expressionlessly. "Okay, no idle chit-chat." She tried the head-on approach. "What brings you to Mr. Fisk's office?" "That's not something Mr. Fisk wishes us to discuss, ma'am," he said. A swing and a miss, but not entirely a waste of effort. She now knew Fisk was bringing in military types for something he didn't want her to discuss. It might be nothing more than a vandalism at a construction site, but somehow she doubted it. An hour later, after a tedious and unenlightening meeting with the accounting officer, MJ was on her way out and stopped to say goodbye to the security guard. She was always friendly with the guards on her way in and out. She was outgoing by nature, which was one of the reasons she wanted to make her living hearing strangers tell their stories. On the other hand, she knew most people hurried past the security desk, treating the workers there as impotents rather than people. A smile and a few kind words garnered no guarantee of anything in return, but it didn't hurt. "See you next time," she said, peering at his name tag. "Hank." She flashed him a smile. The other one, Therese, was dealing with a visitor. "You have a good day, Miss Watson." She started through, then stopped. "What the hell? It was worth a try." "You know, about an hour ago, I almost got run over by these three enormous guys. They look like ex-Marines or something." He laughed. "Yeah, those gorillas from Rocks on Black Ridge. They don't look like they play around. They're late today, though. Most days they come in by 7:30, and they're out the door again 15 minutes later. Well, try not to make them angry." She laughed and waved as she walked off. So she'd been right. Roxanne Blackridge was a security contractor. She'd have to do a little research, but she was pretty sure that they were involved in more demanding work than chasing off teenagers carrying cans of spray paint. MJ smiled as she walked out of the building. Maybe this would go nowhere. But maybe it was a lead. Either way, finding out was going to be fun. Maya watched the reporter leave the building, stopping to chat with the security guard on her way out. She passed that guard hundreds of times, and never spoken a word that wasn't required by the business at hand. It must be nice, she thought, to be so relaxed around other people. Maya didn't want to be unfriendly, but she didn't really know how to be anything else. She didn't blame her father. It hadn't been easy for her to be a single parent in New York City. Maya didn't remember anything of her mother, who died when she was very little, but she could recall a few snippets from her when they still lived in the reservation in Montana. There were other children there with whom she played, and a pair of kindly women who took care of her. Maya had thought of them as old, but they probably hadn't been more than 40 at the time. One had taught Maya sign language, but then Maya had taught herself to read lips. Even as a little girl, she would not limit herself. She always wanted options, and she never wanted to be in a position of not knowing what people were saying, wherever she was. There's nothing you can do, this woman had told her, her eyes sparkling with wonder. I've never seen anyone learn like you do. It's like you can echo anything. It always stuck with her that she was an echo. There was another powerful memory from those days, a fight involving a man, someone who came to their house. He'd been drunk, looking to hurt them. The two had fought, and Maya had hidden under her bed, not knowing what was happening, hoping her father would come and tell her it was all over. Her father didn't come. The man did. He was hurt, bleeding from his head and pressing a towel against a wound on his side. He managed to pull her out from under the bed. She wiggled free from his hard grasp, but he grabbed her again. His bloody hand grabbed her by the face, and she screamed. The man fell over, and her father stood across the room, wounded and unsteady, bleeding from his own wound in the shoulder, and holding a smoking gun. She looked in the mirror next to her father and seeing that the bad man had left a bloody handprint on her face. For years after, she dreamed about herself that way, as though it was a part of her face, like she wasn't herself without the handprint. They left that night. People wouldn't understand. Her father had said, the man who tried to kill them was an important white man from town, friends with policemen and politicians. They would never believe him when he said he'd been attacked. Years later, she wondered, but at the time, it hadn't occurred to her to question his word. It never occurred to her to complain when he put her in schools where the other children had made fun of her and excluded her, because when she came home, he was waiting, and he made her feel like there was a place in the world where she belonged. There were times when he was gone for hours or days at a time, though, and their neighborhoods watched out for her, but that was just a part of life, and it didn't diminish the love she felt for her father. After Spider-Man left her an orphan, Maya's incomplete records, her poor grades, her spotty attendance records, all confused the city's social workers. They treated her as a problem, as a criminal. She could remember that time clearly if she wanted to, but she chose to forget. It was easier to forget. She didn't want to think what would have become of her if Mr. Fisk hadn't taken an interest in the orphan daughter of a minor business associate. It wasn't that Maya couldn't be social when the situation called for it. After all, mimicry was her greatest skill. She noted who was successful and who wasn't, and she could make herself emulate their body language. That was easy. Knowing what to say to a near stranger, how to make small talks that didn't feel strained or awkward, that was something else entirely. It certainly didn't matter for her next appointment, since it was with a man who neither valued nor practiced friendliness. Jameson wanted to meet her by the hot dog vendor again. He was already finishing what she presumed was at least his second dog. She checked her watch to make sure she wasn't late. I got here early, he said. I wanted to talk and not let you watch my lunch get cold. I hope nothing's wrong, she said. I've heard some of your broadcasts, and I'm told the ratings are strong. The numbers look great, he told her.
People want to hear what I have to say. They're sick of what mainstream media types like Robertson are feeding them.
The incident in Times Square seems to have come at a perfect time for you. His eyes narrowed.
Maybe a little too perfect.
Maya almost laughed at that. Did he think she would actually coordinate an attack like that, simply to boost his ratings? The attack had been coordinated, though. Mr. Fisk had brought Bingham in, and people died. She knew that Mr. Fisk hadn't attended it, and that sometimes, in any great operation, with many wheels turning, accidents happen. She wouldn't condemn him if an accident at a construction site left people dead. A voice told her that this was different, but she didn't want to think about it. Not yet. Not until she knew more. Let's not jump into any crazy theories, Mr. Jameson.
One of my crazy theories was that there was unsavory money supporting my show. You told me I was wrong, but I'm a journalist, young lady. You think all those years behind a desk made me forget how to do a little digging?
He looked straight at her.
The money is coming from Fisk.
I told you, she said, that there were business interests in the city that wanted to hear your voice. Mr. Fisk is one of those interests.
You know perfectly well I wouldn't have accepted money from the kingpin of crime.
Do not call him that, she said. Those charges were disproved.
No, they weren't proved, he said, which isn't the same thing. Still, he had his day in court, which is more than we can say for Spider-Man.
No one is doing more to help the city than Mr. Fisk, she said firmly. He knows the false charges brought against him have biased a number of people, and that's why he wanted to keep his name out of it. But think, Mr. Fisk, you were one of the voices leading the charges against Mr. Fisk before the trial exonerated him. Why would he wanted you on the air if he had something to hide? The truth was, she knew. He wouldn't have wanted Jameson on the air at all. Fisk's empire was large enough that it might be some time before he realized he had Jameson on the payroll. By then, Maya hoped the show would be profitable enough for Mr. Fisk to overlook her part in the project, all without his permission. For Maya, though, it was something more. This was a way to do something, to push Spider-Man that much closer to exposure. She was playing a part in his eventual downfall, and she wasn't about to stop.
I don't like it,
Jameson said. I understand, Maya said casually. What she understood, though, was that having his voice heard all over the city was intoxicating for the man. Being able to voice whatever condemnation came to mind with no filter was something Jameson desired very much. She very much doubted he was going to walk away. He peered at her, uncertain of what to make of her terse reply. He was used to causing people to roll over or flee. He was, she presumed, unused to indifference.
If I get wind of a story that makes Fisk look bad, I'm not going to ignore it, he said. I'll say whatever needs to be said. Honestly, I don't know why I even bother with this radio station. I could have one of those, pod blasts and not be answerable to anyone.
Thinking of the show as an opportunity to build an audience, Maya said, for your future podcast.
Think you're pretty clever correcting me, don't you?
Maya pressed her lips together in all business sort of smile. Mr. Jameson, we only want your candor. No one is asking you to pull your punches. It's why you're vital to the city. Have you reviewed and signed the revised contracts? This had been a speed bump. The first contracts had included a critical typo. Someone's head had rolled, and they'd had to be redrafted and signed again. Had Jameson really wanted out, it would have been easy for him to sever ties. Still, she wagered, he was unwilling to walk away from a growing audience. He reached into his coat, pulled out a bulky envelope, and handed it to her. She took it, careful to avoid a large mustard stain.
"Signed and notarized," he said. "But that contract allows me to say what I want and to walk away if you pressure me to do otherwise."
We want an honest voice, she said. Nothing more.
"Then that's what you'll get," he said. "Whether you like it or not."
Bingham was too far away to hear what they were saying. He wished he had the deaf girl's ability to read lips. That would be handy. Or mind reading. He liked that too. But that wasn't a spider power. And he can only do spider things, like sneak around without people noticing. That got him close enough to pick up a word or two, and he definitely heard them say something about contracts. Maybe this time he'd get lucky. After she left the old guy with a thing for hot dogs, she headed east, and Bingham kept after her at a safe distance. He watched as she went into one of the Fisk offices on the east side. She came out 20 minutes later, no longer carrying the envelope. Contracts. Chances were a copy would go right into the safe. Good thing he managed to put a tracker on the envelope before the deaf girl arrived. The old grump had given him an earful for bumping into him. But Bingham had kept on walking. Just another day in the city, right? He smiled to himself. He was one step closer to his goal.